Hi, and thanks a lot for reaching out about the past perfect tense. I've created this presentation to structure the material a bit and to give you a clear overview of the use, the examples, and the adverbs that work with the past perfect. So let's get started. I'm sure that you're familiar with the theory. It basically says that we use the past perfect when a past action happened before another past action. And this is a definition that, while can be very clear, can also sound particularly tangled at times. So let's look at exactly how this tense works. We'll take an example for that. If you imagine the following statements as part of a larger story, then the storyteller might say at some point, perhaps towards the end of the story, that anyway, we finally arrived at the restaurant. We were stunned to discover that our friends had organized a surprise party for us. So here we have an instance of the use of the past perfect, but which one is it? Well, it's easy to identify it. It stands out a bit. It's had organized. So how exactly do we recognize it so easily? First, you got the structure. Had, the auxiliary, which is non-negotiable, it's got to be had and no other form of it at all times when you use the past perfect, plus the past participle of the actual action, in this case, organized. It's the third form of the verb. But then, and perhaps most importantly, you have the use. Had organized is that action which happened before the others. Let's look at a timeline. It might make things a bit clearer, a bit more visual at least. So, the moment of speech is the moment in the present when somebody says something, right? The moment of speech does not appear in the sentence. It's the actual act of talking. But you have the past tense, and the past tense can be seen in two of the three actions that we have streamed here. It's the moment we arrived at the restaurant and the fact that we were stunned, we were surprised by what our friends had done. Now, both of these actions happen, we could say, simultaneously, so at the same time. In the past, we stepped into the restaurant, boom, we were surprised. Before that, though, because this surprise party, was not in the spur of the moment. Our friends plotted it, they planned it, and they did that in advance. And it's this in advance part that is reflected by the past perfect. They had organized the surprise party long before we arrived at the restaurant, and we were pleasantly surprised. So, if you noticed, and I'll get back to this actually, in this example, there are no clues, there are no adverbs that indicate, hey, listen, you've got to use your past perfect here. What stands behind the use is the actual logic of the actions. It's the fact that compared to arriving and being surprised, the organization of the party happened before. But sometimes you do get clues in the way you form your sentences or in the way that they are already constructed in the texts that you read. And those clues are time adverbials. By the time, or simply by, before, until, after, as soon as, and once. So let's look at a few examples, which I color-coded so that it's perhaps easier to spot which action happened closer to the moment of speech but still in the past, and which action happened furthest back in the past. I color-coded them as action 1, the one that's the past perfect, the one that's the most distant to the present moment, and then the second one, the yellow one, which is closer to the present moment but still in the past. So, if we look at by or by the time, Sarah had finished all her work by 2 p.m. and was ready to go home. Clearly, we're talking about two time frames here, two distinct ones. We've got the 2 p.m. moment when she was ready to go home, and that's the yellow action. And then before that, she had to have done all this homework, all this work that she finally managed to finish. Now, you can use by the time plus another action, and this way you link one or more, perhaps, actions together. The reality of it is still the same, though. Sarah had finished the work before I arrived. and before we clearly went out for lunch together. So before and until would be our next clues. As you can see here, John hadn't spoken a word before he heard his name. He might have been half asleep in the meeting or during class, but then he heard his name and he started talking. Both of these actions need to be separated somehow, and they need to be arranged on the axis of time. And it's the past perfect that helps us. Hadn't spoken before the past tense, before he heard his name. And you can use it with until as well. I like this example because it gives you a view of the fact that you can use two actions in the past perfect. What you need to do before you use them is to decide which one was in the past and which ones happened before. I hadn't realized and we hadn't spoken before you mentioned them. Now, after works along the same logic, it's just that it reverses the sentences and implicitly the tenses. In your speech or in your writing. I only got some spare time for myself after I had finished my assignment. The logic behind it is the same. First, I needed to have finished my assignment, and then I got some spare time for myself. Finally, and this is more of a luxury, I would say, most native speakers wouldn't necessarily go for he called me as soon as he'd got off work in speech. We probably see he had got off work in writing maybe, but to be honest here, you would probably be better off or sound a bit more natural by saying he called me as soon as he got off work. He called me once he got off work. It's simpler in speech, but for exam purposes, where you might be tested on your explicit use of grammar and knowledge of it, I do advise that you think this through and you identify the fact that he had got off work before he called me. So I need to use the past perfect there. All right. When do you not use the past perfect? And this is a frequent misconception about it by candidates in many English exams and by speakers of various mother tongues, I would say. The temptation to complicate, I would say, your sentences. I had finished my assignment yesterday. This is incorrect. It's incorrect because we know when you finished your assignment. We know it was yesterday. So it didn't happen before. It happened at that time, at the moment that I'm communicating in the sentence. So the correct one would be I had finished my assignment before you called me. This way, I am arranging two actions on the sequence of time. And therefore, the conclusion would be that you do not use the past perfect when you don't have at least two events that happened one before the other in the past. In the first sentence, there is only one event, and that one happened yesterday, not before it. In the second sentence, you've got two events, so that's where it's worth thinking about which one happened first. And if it's relevant, use the past perfect, just as you can see on the screen. So, what's our takeaway from this one? The structure. Non-negotiably, as I said, had plus past participle. Then the use requires the speaker or the writer to give some extra thought to the sequence of events, which one happened before, which one happened next. And finally, sometimes we are blessed enough to have some clues, some time adverbs and adverbials that help us with the use. So I hope this helps, and I hope you'll let me know if there are any further questions. Good luck.